The ship hung above the earth like a cathedral built by something that had never known mercy. It was called, in the translated records humanity would later study for decades, the Vethkura, which their linguists eventually rendered as the patient wound. A name chosen by a civilization that measured time in geological epochs and had never, not once in 11,000 years of expansion, encountered a species that did not either submit or die within the grace period. 7 days. That was what the Kareth gave you. 7 days to organize your governments. 7 days to compose your formal instruments of surrender. 7 days to begin the orderly process of becoming a vassal state, a resource extraction zone, technically, though they used softer language. Something that translated roughly to a ward of the Dominion, a phrase that was, in their culture, considered generous. The broadcast had come on a Tuesday, which nobody had asked for, and which Earth's news cycle had treated with the particular brand of panicked absurdity it reserved for events too large to properly process. There were memes within the hour. There were petitions. Several governments collapsed and reformed within the first 48 hours. The United Nations convened 11 emergency sessions and produced 412 pages of procedural debate. And from the people who would actually decide the fate of the planet, silence. The Kareth monitoring teams noted this and filed it under behavioral subcategory, fear-induced paralysis. It was the most common response among pre-contact civilizations. The silence, they had learned, was almost always followed by frantic last-minute negotiation on day 6 or 7. They had learned to wait it out. The silence meant nothing. They were wrong. The silence meant everything. Fleet Commander Suvithin watched the blue-green world rotate beneath him from the observation deck of the Vethkura and felt, as he always did in these moments, a quiet and professional satisfaction. He was not a cruel being. He wanted that understood, though there was no one present to understand it. He did not enjoy conquest for its own sake. He enjoyed order. He enjoyed the elegant mathematics of civilization management, the careful integration of a new resource base into the Dominion's existing supply chains, the pacification curves, the assimilation timelines. There was beauty in it, if you knew where to look. The humans were, by every metric his analysts had provided, a thoroughly unremarkable species, moderately intelligent, fractious, technologically primitive by at least 3 centuries compared to Kareth standards. They had barely cracked open their own solar system. Their largest off-world installations were a handful of orbital platforms, a small permanent settlement on their moon, and a loose network of deep space hauling operations that serviced asteroid mining concerns. That last point was worth noting. His science division had flagged it. The humans moved a surprising volume of raw material through their local space for a species at their developmental stage. Millions of tons of ore and processed metal shuttled on slow, ugly cargo ships between the belt and their inner system. Suvithin had reviewed the footage of these vessels. Enormous, graceless things. More tugboat than starship. Designed not for speed or elegance, but for the brute force movement of mass. Industrial machines. The pilots who flew them were, according to intercepted communications, not considered prestigious members of their society. They were roughnecks, tradespeople, workers. He had noted this detail and then set it aside, because it did not seem relevant to anything. He was wrong about that too. On day 1, Mara Okonkwo was running a tether check on the mining rig she had been living and working on for the past 14 months when the broadcast came through. She listened to it twice, finished her tether check, filed her maintenance report, and then went to the galley to make coffee. Her crewmate, a broad, weathered man named Dmitry Voloshin, who had been hauling rock through the belt for going on 20 years, was already there. He had a mug in his hand and was staring at the wall with the expression of a man doing complex arithmetic. "You heard it," Mara said. "Heard it. What are you thinking?" Dmitry took a slow sip of coffee. "I'm thinking about tonnage." Mara sat down across from him. She had worked with Dmitry long enough to know that when he said something like that, you waited. He was not a man who spoke carelessly. "How far out are we?" he said. "From what?" "From the moon." Mara checked her wrist unit. 4 days at standard hull speed. Maybe 2.5 if we run the drives hot. Dmitry nodded slowly. "And the Castellano brothers," he said. "Where are they running right now?" "Last I heard, they were on the Ceres approach." "What? What are they hauling?" Mara thought about it. "Dense packed silicate. Maybe 180,000 tons. One of the big contracts. Dmitri nodded again. He set his mug down and looked at her with eyes that were doing something she had rarely seen them do. They were bright. They were running fast. Mara, he said, how many ships do we know in this neighborhood? Right now? Full haulers. She started to answer and then stopped. She looked at him. She looked at the wall. She started doing the same arithmetic. Dmitri, she said carefully, what exactly are you thinking about? I'm thinking, he said, that the problem with being the most advanced military force in the galaxy is that you spend all your time thinking about military problems. He picked up his mug again. And I'm thinking that we are not a military force. The silence stretched between them. That ship of theirs, Mara said slowly. It's in a fixed orbital position. Yes. Holding station over Earth. Yes. So it has a velocity relative to the moon's surface. It does. And if something were coming the other way, the closing speed would be additive, Dmitri said. Yes. Mara stared at him for a long time. Then she reached for the comm panel. I'm going to call the Castellano brothers, she said. Good, said Dmitri. I'll start drafting a message to everyone else I know. There were, in the end, 31 ships. They came from everywhere in the inner system. Haulers, rock tuggers, deep belt crawlers, the kind of vessels that the Kareth had looked at and categorized as civilian infrastructure. Non-military, not relevant. The kind of ships that no military doctrine in the Dominion's 11,000 years of expansion had ever considered a threat, because why would you? They were cargo vessels. They carried rocks. Their weapon systems were exactly nothing. Their armor was exactly nothing. Their tactical software was exactly nothing. What they had instead was mass. Collectively, an almost unimaginable amount of it. And tethers. Long, industrial-grade construction tethers, the kind used to move asteroid chunks around, rated for several 100,000 tons of load. Old technology. Simple technology. The kind of technology that worked because physics worked, and physics does not care what century you're in. They didn't all know each other. Some of them had worked together for years, and some had only met over the emergency comm channels that lit up during those 6 days of silence. They were, collectively, Nigerians and Russians and Brazilians and Canadians and Filipinos and Indonesians and about 15 other nationalities, and they argued constantly about the details the way people who work with their hands always argue about the details. Because the details matter when you're talking about moving 150,000 tons of rock and metal at several kilometers per second through the vacuum of space toward a target that has the firepower to reduce a city to glass. They had no generals. Nobody had given them orders. No government had sanctioned this. The UN was still on procedural debate number 200 and something when Dmitry Voloshin sent his first message out, and by the time any official body thought to ask what the belt workers were doing, the plan was already in motion and the ships were already moving. The Kareth, monitoring all human communications, tracked these movements. Their analysts flagged the unusual congregation of civilian cargo vessels on approach vectors roughly consistent with lunar space. The flag was reviewed by a junior monitoring officer named So, who looked at the ships in question, confirmed their classification as civilian industrial vessels, noted the absence of any weapons systems or military capability, and filed the report under category anomalous civilian movement, likely psychological, possible mass migration instinct, no tactical relevance. No tactical relevance. So would later spend a great deal of time thinking about that notation. Day 6, 22 hours before the deadline. Mara was in the pilot's seat with cold coffee and shaking hands, and she was thinking about her grandmother, who had lived through hard things, and who had once told her that the most dangerous person in any situation was not the soldier, but the worker. Because the soldier fights within a system. The worker builds the system. And the worker, pushed far enough, will use what they know to unmake it. She had not fully understood that at the time. She understood it now. The convoy had arranged itself in a long staggered column, spread across a volume of space that looked casual and disorganized because it was, partially, casual and disorganized. These were not trained military pilots flying precision formation. They were cargo haulers who had spent careers developing an almost supernatural intuition for mass, momentum, and trajectory. They understood objects in motion in the way that violinists understand strings. Bone deep, pre-verbal. The math lived in their hands as much as their heads. The tether network had taken the better part of 2 days to rig, and it was the Castellano brothers, Marco and Luca, third-generation belt workers out of a series operation their grandfather had started, who figured out the configuration that would actually work. The kind of rigging that distributed the load across the convoy in a way that let all 31 ships contribute their engine output to a single collective vector while keeping any one ship from taking a stress load that would tear it apart. "We're going to die," said Chun Wei, who was Mara's co-pilot and had said this approximately 40 times over the past 36 hours. "Probably not," said Mara, which was the same thing she had said each time. "This is insane." "Yes. There's no way this works." "The physics works," Mara said. "The physics definitely works. The physics works. We might not survive the physics. That's a separate question." Chunwei looked at her. "You are a terrifying human being." "Thank you," said Mara, and began the final approach sequence. Aboard the Veth Kura, Fleet Commander Suvithan was preparing his response to the formal surrender document that his analysts confidently expected within the next several hours, when the proximity alarm triggered. Not the military proximity alarm, the collision alarm. The system that watched for debris, for micrometeorites, for the random hazards of operating in a system still full of loose rock. He looked at his display. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "What is that?" It was not a question, precisely. It was more the sound a being makes when the universe presents them with something that does not fit inside any of the categories they have built to understand it. What the display showed was 31 large objects moving on an intersecting course with the Veth Kura. Moving fast. Moving in a configuration that was, mathematically, not the configuration of a debris field or a natural formation. Moving in a configuration that was, unmistakably, intentional. Civilian cargo vessels, carrying a combined mass of roughly 2.4 million tons, traveling at a closing velocity that, combined with the Veth Kura's own orbital speed, meant any impact would have the kinetic energy of a weapon that Kareth military doctrine had never bothered to develop because it was absurd. It was absurd because no military force would ever build it. It was logistically monstrous. It required no targeting systems more sophisticated than orbital mechanics. It was inelegant. It was brutish. It was the kind of thing that only worked because of the most basic, inarguable, non-negotiable law in the universe. Mass times velocity. F equals ma. Nobody had ever weaponized a construction fleet before. It had never occurred to anyone to try. Evasive action, Suvithan said, and his voice was very steady because he was a professional. The Veth Kura began to move, and the tethers went taut. This is the part that the analysts and physicists and military historians would spend years arguing about in papers and conference rooms and heated dinner conversations. The Veth Kura was a warship of enormous capability. It could have destroyed any one of those cargo haulers in milliseconds. It had the firepower. It had the targeting systems. What it did not have, what it had never needed, in 11,000 years of reliable military dominance, was a contingency for this. Because the ships were tethered together, not just to each other, but now, in the final seconds, to the Veth Kura itself. Marco Castellano had designed a grapple system out of modified asteroid capture hardware, the kind of thing used to snag rotating rocks and slow them down for processing, and he had fired it into the hull of the flagship in the last window before evasive action began. When the Veth Kura burned its drives to escape, the tethers caught. And 31 ships with 31 sets of engines running at 100% burn held on like they were catching a loose asteroid, which was, mechanically, exactly what they were doing. The flagship couldn't pull free fast enough. The math wouldn't allow it. The mass on the other end of those tethers was too great, the tether rating too high, and the pilots holding the lines had spent their careers learning, with their hands and their bones and their scars, how to hold a line against a moving object. The Veth Kura was dragged. Not toward the ships. The ships were part of the system now. The whole system was rotating. Slowly at first, then faster, the tethers acting as the spoke of a wheel, the moon of Earth acting as the wall at the end of the arc. Fleet Commander Suvithan had time, in those final seconds, to understand what had happened. To understand, with the horrible clarity of a professional seeing an elegant solution for the first time, what he was looking at. It was a sling. A simple, ancient, brutally stupid sling. The kind of mechanism that had been used by human beings for killing things since before they had metal. Point a rock. Swing it around. Let go. Or in this case, don't let go. Let the wall do the work. The impact was visible from Earth's surface. Those who were watching described it differently, depending on who they were. Poets called it a second moon, briefly. Scientists called it a high-velocity kinetic impact event with secondary debris cascade. The belt workers who survived it, when asked years later, mostly said some version of the same thing. It was loud. Even in space, through the hull, it was loud. 11 of the 31 ships were lost in the operation. Crews of 3 to 7. 42 people. Their names are on a memorial now, on the lunar surface, not far from where the debris of the Vethkura is still scattered across a 10-kilometer impact zone that has been designated a permanent heritage site. You can visit it on certain tours. The guides will tell you about the physics. They will show you reconstructions of the tether configuration. They will explain the orbital mechanics in language accessible to teenagers on school trips. What the guides do not always manage to convey, though some of them try, and some of them get close, is the particular quality of mind that designed this solution. It was not the mind of a general. Generals think in terms of force against force, strength against strength, weapon against weapon. It was the mind of a person who had spent 20 years moving rocks around in space for a living, whose grandmother had also moved rocks, whose crew had more combined hours of deep belt hauling than most military pilots had hours of anything. People who understood, in the marrow, that the universe is governed by a small set of rules that do not negotiate, and do not make exceptions, and do not care what your weapons array looks like. Mass times velocity is kinetic energy. A lever long enough moves any weight. The most powerful force in the galaxy is not the most advanced. It is the most applicable. 3 months after the battle, a Kareth diplomatic vessel arrived in the solar system under a flag of non-aggression, which is a concept they had never previously found necessary to use. The diplomat on board was a very old being who had, according to their records, overseen the integration of 47 civilizations into the Dominion. She sat across a table from representatives of 14 Earth governments and the Belt Workers Collective, which had been formally chartered approximately 6 days after the battle and was not, technically, a government, but had been invited because it seemed prudent. Dmitry Voloshin was there representing the collective. He wore the same heavy-duty work jacket he wore on the rig. No one had told him to dress differently, and no one had tried. The diplomat studied him for a long moment. Then she asked, through the translator, how the plan had been developed. Dmitry thought about this. I was thinking about tonnage, he said. The translator rendered this. The diplomat looked at him for a while longer. We have reviewed our records, she said finally. 11,214 years of expansion. Contact with 49 distinct civilizations. She paused. None of them did anything like this. That's because none of them were haulers, Dmitry said. He poured himself some coffee from the thermos he had also brought, because the meeting room's coffee was not strong enough. He offered some to the diplomat. She declined, but the gesture was noted in the official record. What do you want? The diplomat asked. In exchange for not doing this again. Dmitry looked at the government representatives, who looked back at him with expressions that ranged from desperate to relieved to something that might have been joy. He looked at his coffee. He thought about Mara, who was in a hospital in Nairobi recovering from a depressurization injury that would give her trouble for the rest of her life, and who had, from her hospital bed, sent him a message that contained only a thumbs up and the words "still worth it." He thought about 42 names on a wall that wasn't built yet. Fair trade terms for raw material exports, he said. Open exchange of technology. No annexation. No vassalization. And you leave the other species you've been running this play on alone. He looked at her steadily. All of them. The diplomat was quiet for a long time. That is a very ambitious set of demands for a species that does not have a standing military, she said. Dmitry nodded. We don't have a standing military, he agreed. We have 2.4 million tons of rock and the patience to use it. He took a sip of his coffee. And we have more where that came from. The diplomat looked at him. She looked at the 14 government representatives. She looked back at him. I believe you, she said. The treaty that followed took 8 months to negotiate. It was contentious and complicated and at several points nearly collapsed entirely, and the official historians will tell you all about that because it makes for good documentary material. What the historians mention less often because it is harder to put into a documentary, is what happened in the belt during those 8 months. The haulers kept working. They had mortgages. They had fuel costs. They had contracts. 42 colleagues were gone, and the grief was real and enormous, and the belt community held its memorials in the practical, unsentimental way of people who live in hard places, which is to say they held them on shift breaks, and they cried and they talked about the dead, and then they went back to work. Because the rocks still needed moving. Because the work was the work. Because someone somewhere needed what was in those asteroids, and the haulers were the ones who knew how to get it out. And that was true before the Kareth showed up, and it was true after, and the laws of physics had not changed in either direction. On the day the treaty was signed, Mara Okonkwo watched the ceremony from her hospital bed on a tablet that kept buffering. She fell asleep halfway through the signing because her pain medication was strong and the diplomats talked for a long time. She dreamed about tonnage. She woke up to 1,700 messages, of which she read 3 before her doctor came in and told her to rest. The 3 she read were from Dimitri, from Marco Castellano, and from her grandmother, who was 91 years old and still sharp and who had written, in her precise and careful handwriting that someone had scanned and sent as an image. I told you, not the soldier, the worker. Mara looked at that message for a while. Outside her window, the sky was the particular blue of late afternoon in Nairobi, and somewhere above it, invisible in the daylight, the debris of the Vethkara was still raining slowly down on the far side of the moon in a long, thin arc of metal and memory. She typed back, I know, Grandma. I know. Then she put down the tablet and closed her eyes and listened to the ordinary sound of the world going about its business. It was, all things considered, a very good sound.